Welcome to the encore presentation of this MAB Animal Health webinar. We experienced an overwhelming response to this topic, so we know it's timely. We're pleased you've been able to join us today. The webinar is a joint effort on behalf of the American Veterinary Medical Association and the Master of Agribusiness program at Kansas State University. I am Deborah Cole, coordinator of the MAB program, and we will hear from Dr. Mike Dix today. The MAB program is an executive distance-based program offering business training to professionals working full-time in the food, agriculture, and animal health sectors. Our animal health cohort is comprised of students who are practice managers, veterinarians, and individuals working in nutrition, feed, pharmaceuticals, vaccinology, education, and government. The program is built to facilitate earning a master's degree without career interruption, and our students participate in 2 one-week face-to-face campus sessions at the beautiful K-State Olathe campus located in the Kansas City metro area. We are currently taking applications for our 2016 August cohort, and we would encourage you to visit www.mab.ksu.edu for more information regarding the animal health cohort at Olathe. Some housekeeping items for this webinar. There will be some time for questions at the end when we will open the chat feature. If you have questions that arise during the webinar, we would encourage you to tweet them with the hashtag MABWebinar. We will enter them in the queue. Contact information will be listed at the end of the webinar. We have with us today Dr. Mike Dix, who serves as the director for the AVMA's Economics Division. Dr. Dix received his undergraduate degrees in biochemistry and animal science from Cal Poly and his PhD in agricultural economics from the University of Missouri. He has extensive experience with world development, resources, policy, and international trade. Prior to joining the AVMA, Dr. Dix was at Oklahoma State University. And I will turn it over to you, Dr. Dix.
Thanks, Deborah. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Just a couple of things before we get started. It seems like this topic has sort of grown legs in the last a month or so. There have been a lot of articles written on it in various magazines and newspapers. I was asked to do this by the Association of State Medical Veterinary Association executives at our AVMA's annual Veterinary Leadership Conference. And So I'm not a specialist in millennials. So I'm not a sociologist. I'm an economist. And my only reason for doing it was to take a look at how millennials might reshape the workforce, both internally and externally. And so that's what I want to present today is what we know about the workforce and how those millennials may impact the working relations within the profession, as well as the demand for veterinary services externally. So let's get started. Just a little bit of history on some of the documents and some of the books that I read to prepare for this. I will tell you that I spent about a month preparing for this with a house full of millennials. I have 3 of them, my own children that are millennials, and then they had spouses and friends that were there. So we had a lot of discussions about some of the things that were found in this literature. But one of the books that I found really interesting, and one that I would encourage you to read if you're interested in the topic, is by William Strauss and Neil Howe, called Generations. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the concepts that they put forward. And there are a couple of sociologists that have been working on this for quite a while. Not just on millennials, but on the generations in America. They identified that history was the least favored course on college campuses, and that most people don't see a lot of relevance in the study of history or to how that shapes our lives in the future. They also noted that as the generations have progressed in the 20th century, that there was a continuing increase in the preference for consumption over savings, for debt over taxes, and the needs of elders over the needs of children. And they pointed out that history is defined through these generational cycles, and they will talk about those 4 generational cycles that they have identified. So currently we have 5 generations that are defined in living. The oldest one is what's known as the Greatest Generation. That was from 1900 to 1928. Some of those people are still with us. The Silent Generation from 29 to 1945. The largest group prior to the Millennials was the Boomers from 1946 to 1964. And then there was the Busters, the Gen Xers, between 1965 and 1983. And then the Millennials, often called Generation Y or Generation IY, from 1984 to 2002. So as you can tell, a lot of those people born in 2002 have not yet hit the workforce, and so that group is just now starting to hit. And in the professional workforce, it's only 2 or 3 years into that those people into the workforce, and so we'll start to see a lot of those in the next over the next decade. The book on generations talked about this generational diagonal. So if you look at this chart on the right, you'll notice that on the one side you have on the y-axis you'll have the stages of life from youth, rising adulthood, midlife, and elderhood, and then across is the type of era that defines those generations. And so then there are 4 generations that sort of are repeating throughout that. And so if you start at the bottom there, you have this youth being in the hero, the civic protected type of group, and then they'll move to the crisis era in rising adulthood. They move to the high outer-driven era as in midlife, and then elderhood. And so each one of these groups, as they move through this stage, define the groups that follow. And so that those 4 generations continue to revolve. And so what's really interesting about that is what you're going to find is, according to them, that the characteristics of the Millennials are very much the same as the characteristics of the Greatest Generation. So those are civic-minded people, but remember that they go through stages, and they don't show those attributes until they get into that stage. One other thing I want to point out that I want to make sure that everybody understands is that when we talk about these things, we're talking about mean traits, sort of these large generalities, and not everybody is the same in these generations. And one of the reasons for that is because these generations are defined by these 20 to 22 year differences between groups. And so typically the average age of childbearing is in that early 20s. So every 22 years there's a new generation. But that's not always the case. A lot of families have generations where their parents are in their 30s before those kids, and so those kids get the parentage from a group that's out of the sync. So in other words, my parents were the Greatest Generation. They were not from the silent group. And so when I went to school, the kids that were like me, the Boomers, they had younger parents than my parents. So they were getting that input from that generation while I was getting input from the other generation. And then so I was slightly different. And there's a lot of that mixing that's going on. But generally, the cycle, and for most people, on the mean, they are 22 years apart, and they're getting their input from their parents, which is the generation just before them. So I want to make sure we understand that as we go through this. The generational formation, that outlook and attitude are, again, generalizations. They come mostly from popular parenting and education strategies during the generation's youth. So again, you have you have parents and teachers that are providing the guidance for those, as well as the interaction of the students themselves that's defining those characteristics of those generations. And the key is that your life experience, whatever generation you're in, is vastly different than a 30-year-old vet that is 30 years old in 2015. So if you're an older veterinarian, then you're seeing somebody that has got differences in how they're viewing the world than you did when you were 30. And that's really important to understand that generally these are characteristics. So the millennials, again, are this civic type generation. Millennials fall under that, and they tend to favor institution building, civic involvement, and relative secularism. They kind of have this model: I invest in my community and shape it to fit my needs. Now remember that may not be the youthful attitude. That's going to be that attitude as they go through their second stage and third stage of development. So interesting, Tim Elmore in Generation IY, his book on the last chance to save the future, talks about 4 traits of millennials. And that first trait was overwhelmed. 94% of the students are overwhelmed by their lifestyles, 44% so depressed it's difficult to function, and 10% have considered suicide in the past year. And I came up with some discovery of these postcards that were posted at the North American Veterinary Congress in Orlando, where veterinarians had posted comments on a board where they could say anything they wanted to. And I thought that I would use some of those to show you that this is what they're saying. And I thought this one was interesting in terms of the overwhelmed. I think the public really likes veterinarians, but they don't respect us much. They never question paying their MD, but try to get out of paying us. And so again, this is someone that their expectations and what's actually happening are out of whack. And that's important to understand, is that a lot of times that frustration and that depression, that not wanting to cope, comes from the fact that you have different expectations than what actually happens. And so when those two things are out of whack, then you're not satisfied, and you're not going to perform well. A second characteristic was they're overconnected. They're online to perform or escape reality, but they have underdeveloped face-to-face people skills. So again, that's important. Now, there's a lot of people that will say, well, I have millennials that love to talk with people. And again, certainly there are introverts and extroverts in every culture, but by and large, what you find, and I think most people realize that the millennials are much more comfortable on Facebook and social media than they are in one-on-one settings, because that's the medium that they grew up in, and that's the medium that they grew comfortable in. Here's a postcard that I thought reflected that. Shelter medicine is awesome until you have to deal with people. And so that's really interesting to me, is that you're a veterinarian, you're supposed to be trying to help the pet, but you're also supposed to be working with that pet client relationship to try to help improve that human-animal bond. And so to expect that you're not going to have to be working with people, I find that a fascinating statement. A third characteristic was overprotected. And I know a lot of people have heard this, that the millennials had parents that were termed helicopter parents, that they hovered over them, they didn't allow them to make decisions, they constantly tried to set up their life for them so that all obstacles were out of the way, that they could get to do what they wanted to do. And my years, 12 years on the school board and over 30 in education, tells me we saw that shift, where parents would actually call you up and want to know what the grades of the students were, or want to be able to talk to you about why they're not doing well, or why you didn't score them a certain way. And I found that really interesting, because that would have never happened in my day or in the 1990s. So here again, I work at shelters, and I could feel the hatred from regular vets because I steal their business. can't we all work together? Again, they have an expectation that everything is going to be fine, and then when they're confronted with a little bit of conflict, that's a difficult thing for them to take. And so they're not used to that risk taking. They're not used to the idea that taking a risk means that you could fail, but you could learn from that failure and move on. And finally, the last characteristic that they observed was that the millennials feel overserved, that everything that they want should be met, which is a real problem. And I think one of the few generations that has that is that need to have every demand of theirs met. And so they have really high expectations about where they're going and what they're going to be, and those expectations are unlikely to be fully fulfilled. Again, I love vet medicine, but I love free time more. Can I have it all? And that, I think, sort of sums up one of the problems that we're going to be faced with. So what's the point? Why go through all this? Well, as I said in the intro, there's two things that we need to consider. One is with respect to the workforce, that these cross-generational stresses are going to occur when people from different ages expect others to behave in ways that their peer personalities won't allow. So it's unrealistic to expect the millennials are going to function the same way that boomers did, and so we have to be able to understand that and be able to work with that and try to figure out how we're going to work together. And then the second part of that is that demand is affected by taste and preferences. So when you think about demand, there's three things that affect demand, three large categories of things. One is price. Price affects the quantity demanded. Second is income. So income is a demand shifter. The higher the income, the greater the demand. And then finally is this taste and preferences, right? So one of the things to think about is when the Neanderthal diet, the all meat, that diet that said, if you eat lots of protein, you'll be healthier. When that came out, the demand for beef really took off. And that was a change in taste and preferences, and that drove demand. So what you have to understand is these millennials have different tastes and preferences as a generation in total than the generations that came before them. And this is a very large generation. There's 81 million people that are in the millennials, and the last big group was the boomers, who had 71 million. So this is a very large group that's going to come on, and they have a very specific set of tastes and preferences, and we need to understand what those are, because those are going to be the clients of the future. So let's talk about how all that's going to interplay in the workforce. Sorry, here's a postcard. I'm starting to hate being the oldest person in the building. They just don't understand my jokes and remember some really good commercials. Thank God for clients who do. I'm 54, and so, I can tell you in teaching, it was always fun that you would say things like, I don't know how many people are listening that remember the Shell Answer Man. So that's an old commercial that millennials would never get, never think about, and so you can't use those things because they don't have any reference to them. We're talking about how things were in Ronald Reagan's presidency when they weren't alive during Ronald Reagan's presidency. So you have to keep in mind that those millennials haven't been around very long, and you have to get onto the experiences that they understand. Okay, sometimes I wish my manager would spend more time managing rather than watching the cameras and eating food. This again is about expectations and about how they see a business being run. So just in terms of looking at what we're talking about in terms of sheer numbers, in just 15 years, 75% of the veterinarians are likely to be millennials, and only 12% of the boomers will remain. So that's a real swap in the demographics of this profession. And you can see it from the chart at the right. The millennials are approaching 81 million by 2036, whereas the silent generation, the boomers, start to exit strongly at about the same time. If you take a look at the total numbers across the profession, to start at the top there, and so what I've done is I've tried to put them in 20-year increments. Starting in 1938, there were 469 new veterinary entrants to the workforce each year. from the U.S. colleges of veterinary medicine. Population was about 129 million. The total veterinarians at the time was 19,000. So you can see down there at the very bottom here, or next to the bottom, veterinarians per 100,000 people was about 15 veterinarians per 100,000. As we progressed across the time, both the number of new veterinarians entering increased, but so did the U.S. population, and so you had an increasing number of total veterinarians, and that increase was increasing faster than the population, and so we've reached today very close to about 32 veterinarians per 100,000. Now keep in mind that during that same period of time, the tastes and preferences with respect to pets and animals changed, and there was a higher demand for services because pets moved from outside to the bedroom and into the bed, so that they became a family member, and they were treated more like a typical child than an outdoor animal. So the demand for services increased. But as you see in this 20 to 28 period, given what we know about the retirement age of veterinarians and the number of veterinarians coming on board, that we're actually going to see a decline in the total number of veterinarians, which means that we'll have less veterinarians per 100,000 in 2028 than we do today. And again, a lot of these veterinarians in 2028 will begin to be young veterinarians, the millennials. So let's talk about how all of that's going to affect the veterinary markets for education, the market for veterinarians, and the market for veterinary services. So think about where the applicants come from that are applying to vet school, and the majority of those applicants are coming from suburbia. This is an interesting dilemma for us because the millennials prefer urban settings. They want to move to those settings. They don't want to own a car. They want to be more integrated with their peers, and so they're moving to those more dense areas. But right now, the majority of the population is in suburbia, and that's where the majority of veterinarians are coming from and returning to. If we look at where veterinarians are located, distributed across the U.S., we can go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, what they call the location quotient of veterinarians. And so what that location quotient is it takes the total number of veterinarians per 100,000 people employed, and it divides for that location for a specific zip code or a county, and it divides that by the national number of veterinarians per 100,000 people employed. So if it's greater than 1, then that means there's more veterinarians than the average for the U.S. And if it's less than 1, that means there's less veterinarians than the average for the U.S. And so as you look, the dark colors here are highly concentrated areas of veterinarians. Now remember that that's veterinarians per 100,000 people employed. So if there's a low level of employment, it doesn't take very many veterinarians to be that, but this is all based on what it is compared to the national average. Over here in San Francisco, you have one of the lowest concentrations of veterinarians in the United States. So it's less than 0.5. So on average, there's half as many veterinarians per 100,000 people employed as compared to the national average. And so you can see that there's these lighter spots here have less than 1, whereas as it gets darker, has greater than 1. So there is this maldistribution of veterinarians around the United States, and we know that as concentration of veterinarians increases, the income of those veterinarians declines. And if you're in a place where it's more expensive to live, incomes go up, and if you're in a cheaper place, incomes go down. So all that combined tells you there's a lot of variation in the income and the availability of jobs for veterinarians. Also, we know, and we're looking deeper into this, that there are areas that are underserved by veterinarians substantially, such that there are not enough veterinarians in there to meet the demands of the animal owners, pets or food animals. A lot of that has to do with the inability of those areas to support a business. But nonetheless, those areas are still deficient of veterinary services and need veterinary services. And so one of the things we have to think about is how are we going to serve those areas when we have a large group of people coming on that want to work in urban and suburban settings. So that's going to be a really interesting problem for us into the future, is trying to make sure that we have veterinary services provided where veterinary services are needed in the right proportion. Okay, if we look at the applicants coming in and look at their career path, you'll see that 65% of them, almost 66%, want to go into private practice. 41% have an interest in production large animal. 37% equine. And as you go through that, obviously they don't add up to one because people can pick more than one thing that they're interested in. But it is interesting that given all that distribution, if you then look at the distribution that we find coming out, the majority of the people, about almost 70%, go into companion animal, and very few go into any other types of practice. Again, about almost half of them are pursuing some form of additional education, either internship, residency, or such. So somewhere along the line, these people are coming in. They changed what they want to do, and they're focusing mostly on companion animal. We don't know why that is, and it'd be nice to find out and how that changes over time. If we look at the projected applicants per seat, we can see that we've had a fairly good increase of applicants until 2013, and then we reached a peak in 2013 of about almost 6,800, and that was about equivalent to the last peak that we had, that was back in 1998. And so this number of applicants has had about a 22-year cycle from peak to peak, and so we feel that we may be at that peak now, and that will continue to decline. And it has declined until it rose a little bit in 2016, but it is on a trend to decline. And so we've just trended that out to show you what might happen to those applicants. Now, a lot of things affect those applicants, and I feel like the more people, more of those applicants that go to do service hours in a veterinary clinic and run up to people that are dissatisfied with the profession, and they're dissatisfied because of the high debt, low income, there's going to be probably less people that are willing to make the effort to go into veterinary school than there are today. So if you looked at the number of seats did rise very substantially until about 2013, and we've had a couple of schools come on since then. But really, there's not a lot of emphasis to increase the number of seats or to bring new schools on, and so we don't have any information that suggests that that's going to happen. And so we've just said, let's assume that those seats remain for the 49 U.S. accredited schools, right around 4,200, almost 4,300. And that would mean that the applicant to seat ratio continues to decline over the period and reaches somewhere between 1.4 and 1.5 by 2030. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of starting salary for new graduates? Well, there's two things that affect starting salary. One is the number of graduates, and the other one is GDP, or disposable income of consumers. And so what we've done is we've shown you, here's the number of U.S. grads that we're predicting, and it's leveling off here. It actually increased over this period of time from 2001 to 2015 at about 54 students per year, and so the real weighted income then, as you see, went up very sharply during the economic expansion, and then fell off greatly during the recession, economic contraction, and now it's working its way back, and we expect it to pass the trend line and then sort of level off out here around 2025. And so incomes are going up. Even though the number of graduates is going up, and the fact that it's going to flatten off that number in the outer years will be helpful in raising that income. So if you look at the debt-to-income situation, again, the green line here was the income that we just showed you. Of course, it's flatter now because we've added in debt. And if you look at the real debt forecast, here's what's happened to debt since 2001. It actually dropped a little bit in 2014. It's climbed a little bit in 2015, and we feel that that debt will continue to climb throughout the remainder of the period. because costs are going to go up for the veterinary colleges. Their health care is going to continue to go up. If an economic recession happens, there's going to be less state money to distribute to those schools, and so the student's going to have to pay a larger share, continuing larger share of tuition. So that means that the debt-to-income ratio is, while it's dipped, is going to stay right in that 2 range. It may increase. The economic recession may cause it to increase even more, and so that's going to be a struggle, a financial stressful situation for a lot of graduates. Now, keep in mind that in 2015, the mean debt for graduates, and that includes all graduates, was about $142,000. Although about 16% of those had debt that it was in excess of $220,000. And when you look at the debt-to-income ratio, about 12% had no debt, and so they had a 0 debt-to-income ratio. And on the other hand, we had almost 8%, over 8% that had a greater than 4-to-1 debt-to-income ratio. So there's quite a bit of variation in those numbers, and there's a lot of people that are seeing a lot more stress than that 2-to-1 debt-to-income ratio would suggest. Okay, interesting about the applicants. When we ask the applicants what their willingness to pay for the education, and we compared that with what the 2015 graduating class actually had, you can see that, again, this is the amount of debt that they were willing to accept on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, this was the number or percent of students that said that. And so this blue line shows you the willingness to borrow from the applicants that were applying to school in 2015, and this was the actual debt that the graduates had in 2015. So the students, the applicants coming in are fairly aware of what it costs to go to veterinary school. The problem may be that they don't know what that means in terms of what that debt's going to do to them, to their standard of living when they get out. If you look at the mean income by years, again, that starting salary is important because it sets the stage for these later years. But you can see, as typical for most professionals, salary rises fairly quickly as you gain experience. And so it's really important to have that starting salary, but it's also important to understand how quick that income will increase over time. So that initial debt-to-income ratio quickly becomes less as you gain experience in the profession. One thing of real note that's important is this distinction between the earnings path of males and the earning paths of females. So if you look at the years of experience postgraduate along the bottom here and the level of income on the y-axis, you'll note that in both cases, men and women's salary goes up very steeply in the first 7-8 years, but then women's tends to flatten out while men's continues to go up. And of course, there's a lot of reasons for this. Some will suggest that this is because of the childbearing age of women and their preference for less hours of work to stay home and be with their children. And notice that in the outer years, the women's salary actually exceeds men's. Men tend to taper off quicker, and women tend to stay in the profession longer. So those are different income earning paths, and so we try to caution students that are leaving graduate school and trying to figure out what to do with their loans to consider those income earning paths differently when they make decisions about how to manage their loans. Just to bring that home on the women and why it's so important to understand that difference between women and men is, remember that the boomers leaving, that ratio was less than 20% women and 80% men, and the millennials, it's 80% women and 20% men. So we're going to have a total difference in that and what it means in terms of how we staff our practices based on the fact that we have now 80% women and only 20% men. So this person said, I feel like I should be feeling guilty as a smart and ambitious veterinarian for taking 5 years off for raising my daughter, but it's totally making me happy. And so again, that's the after that, in that 7 to 21 year period, the leveling off of income for women. I want to become a mother, but feel guilty because I would either have to neglect my child or my job. Again, all of these were from veterinarians, and you can see that this is a very real phenomena, that flattening off causes some angst among the female veterinarians because they want to be involved in the family. But as that debt starts to grow for all of those new veterinarians, and they get to that 7-8 year period, this is going to be much harder for them to accomplish, to take time off when they have a heavy debt load. So in terms of job satisfaction and income, there's a definite relationship. If you look here on the top left, you'll see that there's very few people in the high income with low job satisfaction, but there's also a whole lot of people with low income and high job satisfaction. So while there is this relationship between job satisfaction and income, that doesn't mean that you can't be happy with low income, right? But it is interesting that there's very few people that are unsatisfied that have high incomes. So again, it says you can feel the stress by talking to veterinarians. I grew up in a middle-class family in the 80s. Now as a vet, I make more money than my parents did, but because of my loans, I still live paycheck to paycheck and feel guilty spending money on anything. So again, there is a lot of financial stress, and it's increasing. Keep in mind that the debt problem that we're experiencing today really only began about 2006. And in 2006, the debt-to-income ratio was 1.4 to 1. And so that has gone from 1.4 to 1 in 2006. 10 years later, we're at 2 to 1. And again, think about the distribution of that. So that distribution has also peaked up. We have a lot of students out there now that have more than $300,000 of debt on that $70,000 income. So it's a very difficult situation for them. Sometimes they just want to say, I quit. When we ask the veterinarians about their health, you can see that in both 2014 and 2015, the majority of veterinarians said they were either in very good health or excellent health. We don't know what that means, whether they were talking about their mental health or the physical health or just their general well-being, but by and large, there were very few people that felt that their health was poor or fair. And even more importantly, when we, let me come back to that. When we looked at the work preference by gender, another interesting one, getting back to the life stage, the earning path of the veterinarians, when we looked at the male preferences for work, we found that over time, if you look at 1 year out, 5 year out, 10 years out, 15 years out, and 25 years out from veterinary practice, you'll note that the number of veterinarians, or the percent of veterinarians that wanted to work more hours for more compensation, declined as they went through, whereas the number that wanted to work, or the percent that wanted to work fewer hours for less compensation, increased as they went out. But you also notice that there were more in the 1 and 5 years out that wanted to work more hours for more compensation than there were that wanted to work fewer hours for fewer compensation. So if you think about that, over time, when men first get out, there's a lot of them that want to work a lot of hours and really want to make a lot of money for whatever reason. But as they get older, they tend to want to work fewer hours. Now, interesting enough, the average hourly work week for all males in the profession is about 47 hours. On the other hand, for females, just a different situation. There's in no years is the number of women that want to work more hours for more compensation greater than the number of women that want to work less hours for less compensation. And again, the average hourly work week for women is 41 hours, so 6 hours less per week than men. If you look at the burnout score for veterinarians to try to figure out how they're feeling, how their mental health is, we used a process that's been used on 93 other professions, and they came up with these standardized scores down here in the lower left-hand corner. The low level of burnout is less than 22, average is between 23 and 41, and the high is over 42. And so we surveyed veterinarians. They respond to a bunch of questions. Those questions are then computed into a score, and that score is reported. And so as you look at these 1989 graduating class, the 1999 graduating class, etc., across the bottom, the red dot is the mean score, and then the blue line represents 2 standard deviations. And so even within 2 standard deviations, there's none of the veterinarians in 2 standard deviations that was above the average score, so that nobody fell into that high burnout score. They were all, the mean was very close to the low score. So there is not a lot of burnout according to our findings in the veterinary profession. If we look at the debt-to-income effect on the net present value, now remember that the net present value is the value of that DVM degree. So what it does is it says, how much money do I make as a DVM versus how much money would I have made if I had just gotten my bachelor's degree? And of course it subtracts out the debt that you owe from that income, as well as the opportunity cost that you missed by going to school for 4 more years rather than working. So the importance of this chart, across the top is the income, right? And on the left is the debt. And what this shows here is if you look at the debt at 0, all right, and it's $70,000 income, then your net present value is $589,000. That means that with 0 debt and $70,000 starting salary, you're going to make $589,000 more over your lifetime, following the average earning path of all of the veterinarians that came before you, than you would have if you'd have done just a bachelor's degree. And that also pays for your debt and those 4 years that you didn't work while you were in school. So if you had $50,000 of debt, your net present value at $70,000 of income would be $534,291. So there was a drop. All right. When you come over and look at the break-even income that's required at those 2 levels of debt, you'll note that if I increase my debt from 0 to $50,000, I need to increase my income from $49,000 to $50,957 to break even, so that I have 0 net present value. All right. Now, that means that for every $2,000 of income, right, that's a starting salary, and then I take the trajectory of that over time, right. If I take that $2,000 increase in starting salary, that essentially offsets $50,000 of debt. And the point is that it's much easier to try to work on increasing the income, right? So a $2,000 increase might require $10,000 of production than it is to try to lower the debt by $50,000. So again, this is something that to talk about to the millennials. The millennials are going to be coming in with large amount of debt. It's not as important to try to cut that debt as it is to try to raise that income, because there is a high potential for raising that income and a low potential for raising that, lowering that debt, and it's going to be much more difficult to lower the $50,000 of debt across all colleges than it is to try to increase that income. So that's a really important distinction that we need to make in terms of that debt-to-income ratio. Okay, so why is all this important? Why is the debt-to-income ratio so important? Again, we go back to those expectations of I'm going to school, I'm going to get a professional degree, and I have this idea about what my standard of living is going to be, and especially because I've been out and seen other veterinarians, and I look at their standard of living. Now remember that those other veterinarians that are out there probably didn't have that high of a debt-to-income ratio, and so you're building expectations that probably aren't going to be the same for you unless you have some external support for your education. So if you look at that, we compared an average veterinary family that's out 1 to 5 years with the 80th percentile of Americans. So in the 80th percentile, so that's the top 20% of income earners, they earn about $83,831 for the family. And the average veterinary family at 1 to 5 years is earning $84,972. So they're very comparable. Now the average 80th percentile family is 46 years of age, while that average 1 to 5 year out is just over 30 years of age. Okay, so what did they have to give up in order to have this $10,970 of loan payments. They had to give up, and what they did give up, they told us, was car and transportation expenses. So they have half as much expenditure on car and transportation as the average American family in their same income class, and they spent 1/3 as much on recreation and leisure, almost 1/4 as much. And so when we talk about expectations, how important is car and transportation and recreation and leisure to millennials? Well, that's an interesting debate. Most of the millennials that I've had contact with say this isn't very important, cars and transportation. In fact, they don't want to have cars and transportation. That may not be true for a veterinarian. But this one's very important, recreation and leisure. And so that's where they're getting stung, and that's going to build on their satisfaction level. So the less money they spend on recreation and leisure, the less satisfied with life they're going to be. Again, just real briefly to talk about thinking about those millennials and how they're going to pay that debt off. Typically, everybody's thinking about doing it in 25 years. Some are using income-based repayment plans, but a standard 25 years, paying $150,000 debt at 6.7% interest. That would be a monthly payment of about $1,032, and the total cost would be $309. If you were to double up on those payments, so again, if you had an extra $1,000 a month, if you increase those sales, your production, such that you've got an extra $1,000 a month sales or income, that would reduce your payment to 8 years and that total debt to $193. Now, keep in mind, the reason I picked 8 was because that was the average year at which the beginning new veterinarian wants to start taking time off for family. This is shows you a chart that shows you the various repayment options and what that means, and I like to think about this red arrow here as being the pain threshold. And so if you think about this is your on a $70,000 starting salary with $250,000 of debt, your take home is around $4,000 to begin, and then this gives you the following what other veterinarians have done. This gives you the earnings path, the difference between this earnings path, monthly salary with no debt, and these different types of loan options and how that payment is going to be tells you how much pain you're going to have in terms of the reduction in your standard of living. So the blue line here is for the 10-year standard. I'm going to try to pay that off in 10 years, and you can see that's a pretty large pain threshold. But after 10 years, you have no more debt, and so now you're better off than all the other payment options. Again, starting off, your starting take-home pay would be about $4,000. If you went for the 10-year option, the payments that would be necessary, your take-home is going to be just over $1,000. So that'd be really tough. But notice that by the end of the decade, you'd have about a $2,000 disposable income after making that loan payment. And so you can see that we put in the 25-year IVR, the income-based income-based rate payment, and that includes a savings rate of about $300 a month to make sure that you have enough money at the end of the payment, 25 years, to pay the taxes on the deferred principal and interest. So that gives you an idea about the pain threshold that these new veterinarians are going to be faced. In either case, their standard of living is going to be reduced by about a fourth, by as much as 3/4, depending on what that loan option is. And those first 10 years for that person is going to be very critical. And again, keep in mind that we have to consider that 80% of those new veterinarians are female, and they're going to be looking for trimming their work schedules in that 7 to 8 years out period. So how we help them do that by managing that debt is going to be critical. So finally, satisfaction has to do with expectations and performance. I've been talking about that all through the talk. Your expectation, you have a certain set of expectations, and your ability to perform those expectations for that reality to meet those expectations will leave you satisfied if your performance doesn't meet that expectation, you're going to be unsatisfied, and it's that stress that's caused by that continuous lack of satisfaction that leads to mental health issues. And so we really have to pay attention to that, especially with the millennials, who are very driven, very civic-minded, want things to get better, have high expectations, and so when they come into the workforce, they're going to be setting themselves up for this clash between expectations and reality, and that's going to affect their lifestyle. It's going to affect their feelings about the profession, and it's going to affect their functioning in their current employment. So finally, just to summarize, we have a need to understand the millennials. We need to work with them. They're going to be a major component of the workforce, and so the quicker we understand what it is that they need and how to interact with them, the better off everybody's going to be. And then we need to market veterinary services to them. So we need to understand their tastes and preferences. They're not going to be wanting the same types of veterinary services, the same kind of client services as that we've been providing the Gen Xers and the Boomers. Their expectations are out of line with reality. They have not been exposed or exposed to a lot of the risk-taking that's really going to happen to them. They're not understanding what their financial contributions are going to be or what their financial stress levels are going to be based on that debt-to-income ratio. The millennials like to look for answers on the internet. This will be the first generation that's actually, when they read something, they'll have to determine the truth of it. Back in our day as Boomers, when something was printed, we knew pretty well that it was the truth, and that's no longer the case. And so we have to consider those consumers, particularly that want to do Dr. Google, how true is that information, and how do we relate to them, given the fact that we know they're going to do that before they come to veterinary practice. So these millennials represent a change in taste and preferences and a returning to the cities, and those are the two things we really need to focus on and try to discover how are those changes in taste and preferences going to affect the demand for services. How are those changes in taste and preferences going to affect what they need in the workforce? Millennials value social networking and aren't shy about sharing opinions. They refuse to remain passive consumers. They want to participate in product development and marketing. They demand authenticity and transparency. And those are I think the two key things to think about. That they refuse to remain passive, and they demand authenticity and transparency. So just a couple again of the postcards. I'm a new graduate. I'm sick of being lied to by those who hire me. I have no support from the owner of the clinic because he is selling, because he is burned out. I was told I was doing large animal ambulatory, but I am mostly doing small animal euthanasias. So again, the idea of transparency. And then finally, if your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you're a leader, and that's what we need. We need people, practice owners, and people out there that are employers of these young veterinarians to inspire them and to allow them to move forward. They hold a lot of the answers that we're going to be needing, and it behooves us to try to listen to them and understand their goals and aspirations. So that's all I have. I'm on for as long as you need to answer any questions.
I've enabled the chat feature within the webinar. So if you are on a computer and you'd like to type a question in at the bottom of the page, please feel free to do so. Alternately, you may tweet to @KSUMAB with the hashtag MABwebinar, and we will be monitoring the Twitter feed as well. Carol, did you have a question? If there are no questions at this time, I would like to thank you for being with us today. For more information about the MAB Animal Health Cohort, you may contact me, and Dr. Dix can always be reached as well via his email, which is posted here. We will be sending out a link to the recording of the presentation and a PDF of the slides so that you may have those. And again, thank you, and thank you, Dr. Dix.
So long, everyone.